So welcome everybody, and also want to welcome Bob's family, who is here. So Bob's going to tell us today about tales from his memoir. And Bob really requires no introduction, but he gave me a few cliff notes. So I'll tell you those. So he graduated from Amherst College. He graduated from Amherst College with honors, and then he went to Harvard Law School, where and he also is Phi Beta Kappa, I believe. And then he was at Harvard Law School, and following that, he was the founding partner for a leading...
Founding in quotes.
Founding in quotes. But anyway, probably, I suspect it wasn't in quotes. Knowing Bob, it was probably not only founding, but managing a partner at a leading law firm here in Boston. And as you can see from the audience, which was overflowing, and so we had to get extra chairs, Bob is very well known and very popular here. I should say he's been here for 14 years, and he moved here with his wife Joan, who passed away 8 years ago, sadly. And Bob, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. First of all, I'm not popular, I'm infamous. And to get people started, I'm glad I got a laugh, but I'm telling a little story of how wonderful we have it here at Newbridge. I thought I was losing my hearing, and I went to the audiologist, and before he tested me, I said, "How much is the hearing aids cost?" And he says, "Well, they're retail for $5,000, but we'll charge you $3,500. I said, $3,500, is that what you said? He said, yes. I said, my hearing's better. Anyway, I told Michael these were tales for my memoir, not from my memoir, because I haven't written it yet. A lot of the stories are from stories I wrote for the Bridge, but I'll get started. I said in my promotion that I would start with how I was a first grade dropout. Well, I guess I was a cut-up when I was 5 or 6 years old, and my parents, my mother especially, didn't want me around the house, so I was 3 months too young to start school. But they got a special permit from the superintendent of schools. And so I started at kindergarten was fine. I could climb the rope part way. I could go down the slide. I made friends with people. But when I got to first grade, Miss Herbert was my teacher, and Miss Herbert made me write with my right hand. I was a lefty, so I could make an N, but I couldn't make an M. And I went home and told my parents that Miss Herbert washed my mouth out with soap and put my head in the water fountain, which was untrue, of course. But my dad took me in his furniture truck. He drove every morning to the furniture store, his furniture store. And he took me to the school for a couple of weeks, and each day I ran home. I had to run by Northampton Street, which was Route 5, which is the main thoroughfare. So after a few weeks, they decided it was more important for me to be alive than to be in school. So they kept me out of school for the whole year. So I started the next year. During that year, my mother taught me how to read, taught me how to write the alphabet. And the next year, I went to Miss Baldwin, which was the other first grade teacher, who was a customer of the furniture store. And she let me write with my left hand, and I succeeded in first grade. Now, I'm going to read, to show you I was still a cut-up in second grade, an essay I wrote in the second grade. This is, the teacher asked us to write something that happened a day before class. So this is, I a picture of the actual letter that I wrote, good handwriting. Dear Miss Connor, yesterday I watched the painters paint my house. After a while I went to the parade. When we came home, it was time for dinner. We stayed at home for an hour. Then we went swimming for a half hour. You can see it's a few days. Then we went for a ride down the street. When we were going, we saw 2 police cars. 2 policemen were bringing a man out of the block. He was being arrested. He was my father's friend and customer. We did not know what happened till this morning. He had shot his wife 4 times and missed once. We were very sorry for him. He was a cop himself. So I got through grammar school. I got through junior high school. High school, as Michael said, I applied for Amherst College. I was turned down because I flunked the math SATs. And my dad saw how rejected I was, and he said, why was I dejected? And he said, I told him because I was turned down at Amherst. I really wanted to go there. And he got me in his car. He wouldn't take the truck to Amherst College. He got me in his car, drove me to Amherst, asked for the admissions dean, and the dean's assistant took me into the dean's office with my file. And the dean said, why are you here, Mr. Weinstein? And he told him, he said, because when I was my son's age, I was doing forced labor for the Germans in Poland, Russia, and I never got an education, and I wanted him to have a good education. And the dean said, well, we have a required math course, and he might flunk out. If you can get a letter from his math teacher saying he won't flunk out, maybe we'll give him a chance. But I'm not promising, but maybe we'll give him a chance. So it so happens that my algebra teacher, my geometry teacher, and the principal of the high school were all my dad's customers. And they wrote letters. Boy, if I could do math, they said I would not flunk out. So obviously they took me into Amherst. The dean accepted me. And the first story I had was the first week at Amherst. My roommates were Francis Malcolm Child and William Harrison Pritchard. And they put on the junior, William Harrison Pritchard, and they put on the door of the room. I remember I was in 201 James, and they put on the door, the school puts on the door the names of the people in the room. So William Harrison Pritchard, Frank Malcolm Child Jr., and Robert William Weinstein. Well, after a week, the sign was taken down, and a new sign was put up reading Francis Malcolm Child Jr., or III, and William Harrison Pritchard Jr., and Robert William Winston. Well, wait a minute. I asked them why they did it. And Pritchard says, I'm from Johnson City, New York, and we don't have any Jews there. And Child says, I'm from Teaneck, New Jersey, and we have too many. Now, that's my anti-Semitism story. I've got 2 more, if Michael will give me time at the end to tell them, but I won't tell them now because they're a little somber. When I got through Amherst all right, as Michael said, I did all right. I went to Harvard Law School, and again, first year, when you finish the first year, the honors of the first year are either legal aid, the top 5%. The next 5% is the Board of Student Advisors who've helped people with moot court. And the next 5% is legal aid. Harvard students who made legal aid were allowed to go into probate court and act as lawyers, even though they weren't members of the bar, but the Bar Association let us practice law. And so my first client was a Mrs. Coder, and she came in, paid 35 cents as a fee. That was, and so I went to court for her. What was her problem? Mrs. Coder was owed $10,000 by her former husband. They had been divorced, and he owed her $10,000. So we summons them to court. We get into probate court. Judge Monahan was the judge, and Judge Monahan says we can't find him. He didn't show. He says, I'm going to issue I think he calls it a capias. Peter Shapiro says that's the right term. So capias, they summons him to court the next week. The judge calls him before the bench, and he says, Mr. Kader, and the man comes in. It looks like he was just let out of the drunk tank. He had swollen cheekbones and bruises on his forehead. He was a mess. And the judge says, Mr. Kader, you owe $10,000 in back alimony. Can you start paying? He says, Your Honor, I can't pay. I don't have any money. He says, well, we'll start taking money out of your wages. He says, I'm not working, Your Honor. I was just let out of the hospital. So the judge looks at me and he says, Mr. Weinstein, we can keep this man in jail, throw this man in jail. And I said, Your Honor, I'm only a second-year law student. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. You have to make the decision, Your Honor. At which point my client in the back of the courtroom stands up and says, I'm not being adequately represented. I want a new lawyer. And the judge looks down at me and winks and says, case dismissed. So we move on from the first year. The next episode happened to do, I call it the Grand Furniture Sale. Grand Furniture was owned by the Warshaw family. Yes, Joan Warshaw's family. And her husband, Mark, late husband, Mark, was not only ran Grand Furniture, which was a wholesale furniture business on Canal Street in Boston. People from Boston area know Canal Street in Boston in the wholesale furniture area. Well, Mark also represented a distributor of fine furniture. Was it Unigusta, Charles? Charles was in the furniture store, so he knew Mark as well as I. But Mark knew I could sell furniture, and he came to me at the law firm where I was working. It was called Freeman, Atherton, King and Turner. And Mark said, we know you can sell furniture. Grand Furniture, the wholesale furniture business, is going out of business, and we need salesmen. Can you come and sell furniture? On I said, well, maybe weekends and nights if my firm lets me. I spoke to Frank Kozol, who was a senior partner where I was working, and Frank said, as long as you're not practicing law, you can go work in the furniture store, furniture business. So on a Saturday, I went down there the first day. They were open. The sale was supposed to start at 12 o'clock, noon, and there were only 2 or 3 people and had come up, and Grand Furniture were on floors 2 through 6. They had around 4 floors of fine furniture, and there was only 2 or 3 customers. So I said, Mark, I'm not going to make any money, this way. And I was thinking that my salary was 5% of whatever I sold. So if I sold $10,000 worth of furniture, $500 was a lot. It was 10 weeks' pay to me. I think my take-home pay was $50 a week when I started. So I said, Mark, I'm going to go downstairs. Maybe the elevator isn't working. Maybe the signs fell off the elevator. So I went downstairs. And on the first floor, there was a retail furniture store on the first floor called AD Iacono. And between the time I got to Grand Furniture at 11 o'clock and 12 o'clock when we started, they'd put up giant sales saying Grand Furniture Sale. So I went up and told Mark, and Mark says, what can we do? And I said, well, I'll go back to the office and see if I can get an injunction or something to make him take the signs down. So that was on a Saturday, so the next Monday I sent out a letter to IED Iacono to appear in court because I was asking for an injunction to take down the signs. And Henry Gesmer was the lawyer on the other side. He represented AD Iacono. Later then it was Gesmer and Geller. and Rosalie Geller was here. I think Marvin was her uncle. But anyway, or brother-in-law. The next day we show up in court, and the judge is Judge Pecci. And Judge Pecci, my office said was a good judge, but he was the judge in the motion session. And he said, you know, grand is a generic term. You can't stop people from using generic words. And I said, Your Honor, you can't let him deprive us of our advertising and take advantage of our advertising. He says, well, I'm going to think about it. I'm going to lunch. Come back after lunch. We come back after lunch, and the Judge Pecci says, I'm going to recuse myself. I'm not going to hear this. Why? I used to represent A. Diacona when I was in practice before I became a judge. I'm sending you to Judge Thompson in the next courtroom. So we go to Judge Thompson, and Judge Thompson, I realize at this point I have to pull out all stops because I'm opposing Henry Gesmer, who's one of the top lawyers in the city. And I'm just, you know, a month out of law school. I think I had heard from the bar exam that I had passed, but anyway, I was that young. And the judge says, you know, Mr. Weinstein, grand is a generic term. I said, Your Honor, a few years ago in the New Yorker magazine, there was a cartoon, and there was a store with 3 glass windows, 3 windows, and saying, going out of business sale. And there was another store to the next door that said giant fire sale. But in between, there was a little store with 1 pane glass, and it said main entrance. And I said, Your Honor, main and entrance are generic words, but when you allow them to take people's livelihood away or deprive them of what they advertised, judge said, signs come down. That was my first victory in court. Now, why I said I was a founder of a law firm. I was really a flounder. That's because it was a fishy story that I was a founder. That's why I put it in quotes. The firm I was with, Friedman, Athen, King and Turner, became Friedman, Athen, and Sisson and Kozol. There were 5 partners, and they had a fight. So 3 partners stayed, Kozol, Sisson, and Shapiro. And Burns and Levinson left to form their own firm. And Levinson asked me to go with him. And I was only like 3 or 4 years as a lawyer. And Clancy went with Burns, and he was a 3 or 4-year-old lawyer. And we went over as salaried employees. But when they wrote us up, they said that Weinstein was one of the founders of the firm. That's when I said, that's a fishy story, I'm a flounder. And they called me just one of the people who was there when the firm started. But that's my founder story. The next story is when I was with Burns and Levinson, we represented Sonesta Hotels because the Grismish family, whom Burns and Levinson represented, owned half of Sonesta, and the Sonnabend family owned the other half. But we handled the sales of the hotels, and we also handled, they had a chain of motels called the Charter House Motels. And Charter House Motels found they didn't do too well, so they sold off their motels. One sale I remember distinctly was Lynn, and they had a sale. They sold off the motel. I'm using numbers. These aren't the right numbers. I say they sold it for $500,000. They sold it for $100,000 in cash, and $400,000 they took back a purchase money mortgage. Well, the fellow who bought the motel, he happened to be Chris Reclitus, who was a classmate of mine at Amherst, who later went to jail for securities fraud. But be that as it may, they couldn't pay their mortgage. So Joe Finn, who was a best Boston auctioneer, we put big ads in the papers. And Joe Finn conducted the sale. It was around 40 or 50. Not as many people were here, but there were maybe 20 or 30 people gathered around at the sale. And Joe Finn, before he conducts the sale, says, "Are there any questions?" And these two tall blondes, lithe, in their 30s, and they were fairly attractive, said, "Mr. Finn, we'd like to see our offices." And Joe Finn says, "This is a motel. We don't have any offices." And they said, "Well, no, we used to work in those rooms." You guessed what they were? They were prostitutes. That's my episode with the Charterhouse Motel. Then I tell a story that I represented my wife's family who owned, when my father-in-law, whom I never met, he died before I got married. When he was in the wholesale electric supply business, and whenever he didn't like to rent, he didn't like to pay rent, so he'd buy the little premises where he bought. He bought one fancy building, and that was 655 Beacon Street in Boston at Kenmore Square. And that had a retail store on the ground floor and offices, 2 or 3 floors of offices on the top. And he rented, my brother-in-law, Phil Schur, was in charge of renting the properties. Phil had his own business, wholesale shoe business. And the other brother-in-law, Herbie, had his own business, which was a felt business in Holyoke in East Hampton. But anyway, Phil took care of renting 655 Beacon. He rented the ground floor to a store. Well, it was like our gym. It was called Mr. Alex Gyms. The fellow came from California where they had Vic Tanny gyms, and he came to Boston, and they opened up, he called Mr. Alex Gyms. You know, they had the same type of bicycles and equipment we have in our exercise room. And we got a 6-month security deposit, and they stopped paying rent after 3 months. They couldn't make a go of it. By this time, Mr. Alex Gyms, they changed the name to Bob Cousy Gyms, you know, the basketball player, and he couldn't make a go of it, so they sold the name to Rocky Marciano. It became the Rocky Marciano Health Club. So Phil says, "Come with me, Bob." He says, "I want to collect rent, and I want you there to help me collect the rent." So we went to Mr. Alex Gyms at 655 Beacon Street, and next to the Buckminster Hotel. It was a prominent location. And we walk in, and Rocky Marciano was there himself. Now, I don't know if you know Rocky Marciano, but he was not tall, but he was built like a construction worker, had a ham hand. His ham was as big as a hand, 3 times my hand. And we walk in, and Phil Schur says, Rocky Marciano says, "Who are you?" to Phil. And Phil says, "I am your landlord, and I'm here to talk about rent. And who's the man with you?" And Phil says, "That's my lawyer." And Rocky Marciano puts up his fist and says, "Mr. Lawyer, if you open your mouth, you may never open it again." And I said, "Mr. Marciano, if you hit me, you may never fight again." And he opened his hand, put his hand down. When we got outside of the gym, Phil says to me, "How did you have such presence of mind?" I said, "Phil, when you think you're going to die, you get very creative." These are all true stories so far. I'll talk a little bit about my legal career. First couple of years, I had 2 trials, one jury trial and one jury waived. They were both appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. I won them both on appeal. I did the first mass housing project in the state. That was up in Amherst. It was called Rolling Green at Amherst. I did another dozen of mass housing projects. Then we syndicated them, and people bought shares of the partnership. I went around the country doing auxiliary factory plants for manufacturers in Massachusetts. I remember I did work for Arrow Automotive, which was a host, auto parts automotive. I did plants for them in Arkansas and California. I did plants for, and also South Carolina, plants for SMD distributors, which were stationary manufacturers. That was in Philadelphia and Mississippi. But anyway, the most satisfaction I got as a lawyer was what I did for the Solomon Schechter Day School. Solomon Schechter Day School is a conservative day school that when my daughter was around 5 or 6, well, she went to the first grade in public school. Second grade, we weren't happy with the atmosphere at the Runkle School in Brookline because we called it a rich man's school, and we lived in the poor section of Brookline. And so we enrolled her in the Solomon Schechter Day School, which was meeting in Temple Emmanuel in Newton at that time. And my wife said to me, Bob, you got to see what the school is like, because I had never been there during session. And they were meeting where the Hebrew school met, some of them classes were in the powder rooms of the ladies' room, and it just wasn't the place. So I complained to Bernie Pucker, was either the vice president or the president at the time, and I knew him from his gallery on Newbury Street. And Bernie says, I said, Bernie, this is no place to run a school. So he says, Bob, you are now the location church chairman. So I went around looking for places. First I got with Herman Blumberg, who was the first hospice doctor here at Newbridge. And Herman was a Reform rabbi, but running a conservative day school. So you can imagine the hard time people gave him. But anyway, Herman and I got permits to put two trailers in the parking lot of Temple Emmanuel for a couple of grades. And at the end of the year, Temple Emmanuel just said, look, your school is growing. We can't, it's not safe to have you here. So I looked around for a place for Schechter to go. And I heard that a school in Weston was being vacated because Weston didn't have enough grade school students. So I went to the assistant superintendent of Weston Schools. There's a fellow named Stein, S-T-Y-N, S-T-E-Y-N, I think his name was. Wonderful fellow. He said, we don't need it for senior living. The Memorial School was on School Street in Weston. We don't need it for senior living yet for a year. We'll let you have it during this year, but you've got to guarantee you'll be out at the end of the year. And I said, well, we have no alternative. We have no place to go in Temple. So we went there. And during that year, I had to find he only charged us, I say, $1 a year, and we had to pay the utilities. And so during the year, I had to find a place for us to go because we guaranteed somehow, I don't remember how, that we'd be out at the end of the year. And I heard that the Newton schools were vacating the Memorial School in Oak Hill Village. And so I went to Teddy Mann, who was a friend of my wife's family, and I said, Ted, we need a place to be. He says, well, we don't need it for a year, but I said, no, we want to buy it. And he said, how much can you pay? And I said, well, we think we can raise $250,000. He says, well, if that's all you can pay, we want a condition that we can buy it back, say, after 10 years if the school population in Oak Hill Village grows. So everybody decided that was a safe bet. And we went to the finance committee, the Alderman Herman Blumberg and I, Rabbi Blumberg, and we said, we want to buy it. And they said, how much can you pay? We said $250,000 with this condition. And they said, Mayor Mann says you can pay $350,000. Teddy was trying to show that he was not favoring a Jewish day school. And we said, no, it's got to be $250,000 or we can't buy. That's what was agreed to. The next day, the Newton Graphic, that was the name of the paper, then had a headline, Boston lawyer accuses Newton of fraud. But anyway, they sold it to us for $250,000. We got the school, we used it for the year, and Herman asked Sarah and me, because Sarah was a student at the school, to go to the opening, groundbreaking, but they didn't need to do anything because it was a school. And Herman, Rabbi Blumberg asked Sarah to put up the mezuzah, put in the mezuzah. And somebody said to Rabbi Blumberg, Sarah's only a third grade student. Why is she putting up the mezuzah? And Herman said, because if it weren't for her father, we wouldn't be here. And that's the proudest moment I had as being a lawyer. And that's my end of my story, if you'll let me tell my anti-Semitism stories. Do I have time, Michael? I do. Okay. Well, the first story, what time is it? Oh, yeah, we have plenty of time. The first story was when I applied for a job when the phone stops ringing. Okay, I was a third-year law student, and I had done very well at law school. I'd done very well at college. I had a good resume. And I went to all the big firms in Boston, the 100-person firms, and I knew I didn't have a chance because, except for their senior partner, Abe Berkowitz at Ropes and Gray and Dave Burstein at Hale and Dorr, there were one or two Jewish lawyers. And but I went there anyway, and I didn't get a job. So I went to the law firms that had proportional third Jewish, a third Protestant, a third Catholic. And I went to Foley, Hogan, Elliott, and I went to Friedman, Athen, King and Turner, and Foley, Hogan, Elliott. Herb Berman, who was well-known in the Jewish philanthropy circles, took me around. He introduced me to Hans Loser, who was another partner there, who was the son of Holocaust victims. He introduced me to Lou Weinstein, who was a trial lawyer. They all liked me. They took me into Garrett Hoeg as one of the named partners of Foley, Hogan, Elliott. And he said, well, you did very well, young man. He said, but we can't use you. He said, but don't go to one of those firms. And I didn't know what he meant at the time. But I went back to legal aid, where this is my second year of legal aid, and I asked Bob Rosenman, who's the son of Sam Rosenman. I don't know if you know the speechwriter for Roosevelt, Sam Rosenman. And Bob was my classmate and a friend. And I said, you know, Peter Bator, who was another classmate, he's the son-in-law of Garrett Hoeg. Can you find out for me why Foley Hoeg turned me down? So Bob goes, talks to Peter Bator, and he comes back and he says, well, they just hired a Jewish lawyer the year before, and they didn't need one. And I said, what did he mean by one of those law firms? And Peter says, a bankruptcy firm which was run by Jews. And the bankruptcy law firms then were Kahn, Riemer, and Pollack, Wasserman and Salter. And so I was a little wary of Foley, Hogan, Elliott when Herb Berman called me up a day or two later that night, and he says, Hans Loser and I are now in charge of hiring for Foley, Hogan, Elliott. How would you like to be part of Foley, Hogan, Elliott? I said, well, I don't know. It was very hard to get into the firm. I got an offer from Friedman, Athen, King and Turner, even though I knew that the firm was run by Frank Kozol, whose two sons, one was behind me at law school, one was ahead of me at law school. Both were law reviews, so I knew if they came into the firm, my chances of advancing in that firm were remote, but at least I had a fair chance. And so I said to Herb Berman, no, I'm going to take a job with Friedman, Athen, and King and Turner. And that was my episode of anti-Semitism when I graduated law school. When I was practicing law, another episode of anti-Semitism. I had a neighbor when we lived in Brookline named Max Cohen, who was an agent for Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. And he sold my two brothers-in-law, whom I mentioned, life insurance. They could afford it. He sold me life insurance when I couldn't afford it. But he felt sorry for me, so he said, I'm very friendly with the people at Boston Safe Deposit and Trust Company. I'll see if I can get you some clients that I sent into them so you can do their will and trust. Well, they started giving me business that Max Cohen sent them for $150. Peter, that was reasonable. I did their wills and trusts. That was 60 years, 55, 60 years ago. And then somebody from Boston Safe calls me up. I won't give his name. I'll call him trust officer, and he says, I have a family I want you to do with. The father's a doctor, one of the son's a doctor, and one son's a dentist. And I said, sure. So the father, I did his will and trust for $150. He came in the office, signed up his will. You know, in those days, you needed 3 witnesses to be, not just, now I think it's 2. I know it's 2. But it's, then I did the son, the doctor, and I called him up and I says, you got to come in the office so we can sign up your will and trust. He said, you know, I'm a doctor in the day and I moonlight at night. You have to come to the office sort of at dinner time. And I said, you need 3 independent witnesses. He said, I'll have them. I get to the office. I think it was either Nahant or Natick or Lynn, or I forget where it was, Somerville. And I said, where's your 3 witnesses? He said, well, you're one. My secretary receptionist is the second one. And he says, my brother will be the third, because the doctor who was down the hall, he's gone home. And I says, your brother, you left him $5,000 in your will. And I said, I'm not positive, but I think that if he's a witness, the bequest to him is void. And he said, how wonderful. Well, wait a minute. So we signed it up because he knew the consequences. I get back to the office the next day, and I called up the trust officer, and I told him the story, how the doctor said how wonderful. And the trust officer says, that's the silliest thing I ever heard out of a kike's noggin. That's what I said. But anyway, and 5 minutes, I said, okay, and I hung up. And 5 minutes later, he calls me up and he says, did I say what I said? And I said, you said what you said. And he said, will you try to forget it? Well, I tried to forget it, but I couldn't. And one way or the other, I stopped getting business from the Boston Safe Deposit and Trust Company because I did something. I don't remember whether it was talking to his boss or whether I put a family member in as executor trustee instead of putting the bank in as executor trustee. But I stopped getting business. And that's my other anti-Semitism story. And I think I kept within the time, Michael. I'm all done. Were you bored, Jake?
Sure, there are a lot of questions.
Are there any questions or comments? Peter. Tell you about Holyoke. Well, if you read The Bridge, I wrote a lot of stories about Holyoke. I wrote about how I sold ice cream in the ice cream truck, and I went to East Hampton to sell ice cream, and my brother-in-law's felt factory, I sold ice cream, and I sold it in the neighborhood there until my competitor almost hit me coming down the street. And after he almost hit me, a police car came following, and the police chief came out of the car, and he said, you know, you can't sell ice cream on the streets of East Hampton, it was, without ringing your bell. You can't ring your bell. And I said, well, how come my competitor who just came down, he can ring his bell? And he said, well, he's my brother-in-law. I think, Michael, that's enough stories.
Well, Bob, what nobody here knows, Bob charges quite a bit per hour, and all of you will get a bill in the mail tomorrow morning. So,
No, that's why I was looking at my watch all the time.
you didn't mention women, any women, and I know when I went to law school, graduated in '60.
We had 9,
Well, that's
9 out of 500.
Well, we had 3 out of 300. So, and when I went to practice New Hampshire, there were only 3 women practicing law. Only one knew where the courthouse was. It's dramatically changed. But so, I want to also say you mentioned some names that remind me. Joe Finn used to come to New Hampshire to work for us.
Who?
Joe Finn, the
Auctioneer. Well, he
auctioneer.
he was the best auctioneer in Boston.
And he was pretty good in New Hampshire too. And you mentioned Sisson. His son was my counselor at camp.
Gene Sisson's son?
Yeah.
I'll tell you a
Ken-
story about Gene Sisson.
And I think Kozol's son Whitey was he one of the bar council?
That was Lee, it was the white-haired.
Yeah,
It was Lee.
I knew him as Whitey.
He
but,
was law review at law school. And anyway,
but you stopped going to court afterwards.
a quick story, can I tell a quick story? Friedman Athens was founded by a fellow named Lee M. Friedman. And Lee M. Friedman never married, died at the age of 82 or so when I was working at the firm. He had 2 sisters, Sophie and France, I forget the other one's name. They died with a townhouse on Bay State Road. And Lee was the last one to die, and he said anybody in the firm can go take articles out of the house. And I was the last one because I was only a year or so working, and I took some. I remember some napkin holders, sterling silver napkin holders, and some silver picture frames. Well, I took the picture frames home and the napkin holders. Well, the picture frames, Joan looks and says, I don't need pictures of Liam Friedman's Bubby and Zadie. And the picture frames went out. 5 minutes later, she says, hey, those are silver pictures. So she goes, and some of the neighbor had already taken them out of the rubbish. But then the napkin rings, I went to the office, Gene Sisson, what did you find at the home? And I said, some sterling silver napkin rings. He says, how many? I said, I found 4. He says, I think there's some more in the basement. And I'll go in the basement and see if I can get them for you. A couple of weeks later, he was one of the partners, and I was just an associate. I said, Mr. Sisson, what happened to the napkin rings? He said, oh, I found a half a dozen. My son had a couple. I gave him your 4 so he could have a whole dozen. That's my story.
There's a question back there.
Somebody had their hand up.
Guys, raise it high.
So going back to one of your early stories, when you went into the gym and you faced this,
Yeah.
did you walk out with the rent?
We had a 6-month security deposit. We did not walk out with a penny of rent. But the building was taken a couple months later by the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority by eminent domain, and the tail end was needed for the Massachusetts Turnpike. Remember I said it was in Kenmore Square?
Yep.
It was right across the street from Fenway Park. If there are no more questions, I'd be happy. There's a question back there.
Okay, Bob, I've been on the Zoom call on Wednesday, current events, since I've been here about almost 3 years. And I mean, one thing that always hit me about when you spoke up about events at Newbridge and everything was that you consistently were speaking on behalf of people here at Newbridge who had less, and I mean less in terms of finances or whatever resources. And that sat with me about you. I commend it, and I never heard that kind of thing from anyone else on the call. I'm not casting aspersion on anyone. I'm just saying I think it was your lifetime, your early lifetime from legal
No.
aid.
Well, thank you, but my brother Charles and I are still trying.
Okay. Well, please do. Please do.
On that note, I want to thank you. This was just outstanding.